Scandal Rocks, Jerusalem. Rabbi reveals dark family and community. Secrets Ari. Goldstein, a respected religious leader, finds his life turned upside down when he discovers a family secret buried for decades. An investigation into a mysterious synagogue fire leads Ari to unravel a web of lies. Corruption and crime that stretches back generations in Jerusalem's Orthodox Jewish community. Disguised as a chauffeur, Ari plunges into a dangerous underworld, facing threats, betrayals, and moral dilemmas that will test his faith and integrity. As the truth comes to light, families are destroyed, reputations ruined, and the foundations of an entire community are shaken. Will Ari have the courage to expose everything, even if it means losing everything she loves? An electrifying story about the search for truth and the high price of integrity in a world built on lies. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. The Friday sun was slowly setting over Jerusalem's Orthodox Jewish quarter, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Ari Goldstein, a 45-year-old man with a neatly trimmed beard and piercing brown eyes, was adjusting his black hat as he hurried along the cobbled streets. The aroma of freshly baked challah and boiled chicken hung in the air, heralding the imminent arrival of Shabbat. Upon entering his modest but cozy home, Ari was greeted by the warm smile of his wife, Rivka. She was busy lighting the Shabbat candles, her soft face illuminated by the flickering light. Their 4 children, dressed in their best clothes, were eagerly awaiting the start of the holy meal. "Shabbat Shalom," Ari said, his deep voice echoing through the living room. "Shabbat Shalom, dear," Rivka replied, her eyes shining with love and respect. As the family gathered around the table, Ari couldn't help but feel a surge of pride and gratitude. As a respected Torah scholar and community leader, he had dedicated his life to following the precepts of his faith with unwavering devotion. His reputation for integrity and wisdom was known throughout the community. The Shabbat meal took place with the comforting familiarity of a ritual practiced countless times. Ari recited the Kiddush over the wine, blessed the challah bread, and led lively discussions about the weekly Torah portion. His children, aged between 8 and 16, participated actively, asking insightful questions that filled Ari's heart with pride. When the meal came to an end, and the children retired to their rooms, Ari leaned back in his chair, satisfied. It was then that he noticed something unusual. His Uncle Moshe and Aunt Sarah, who had joined the family for dinner, were whispering. In a corner of the room, their faces tense with worry. Curious, Ari leaned in discreetly, trying to catch fragments of their conversation. The words came to him in disconnected, almost inaudible pieces. "We can't keep hiding it," whispered Sarah, her voice trembling with anxiety. "Shh, Moshe," scolded her softly. If he only knew. Ari felt a shiver run down her spine. What were they talking about? Who was he? And what was being hidden? Before she could hear any more, Rivka caught her eye, asking for help, clearing the table. Ari stood up, his mind churning with unasked questions. As he helped his wife, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Ari shared his concerns with Rivka. They were sitting on the bed, the soft light of the lamp casting gentle shadows on their faces. "Rivka," Ari began, his voice low and intense. "I think there's something you're not telling us. Something important." Rivka frowned, her dark eyes full of concern. "What do you mean?" "Ari?" He recounted the whispered conversation he had overheard, watching his wife's expression change from concern to curiosity and then to determination. "Do you think we should investigate?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ari hesitated, weighing up the implications. As a man dedicated to truth and justice, the idea of a family secret disturbed him deeply. On the other hand, he was aware of the possible risks of digging up the past. Yes, he finally replied, his voice firm. I think we should. Whatever it is, we have a right to know. Rivka nodded slowly, trusting her husband's judgment. How are we going to do this without arousing suspicion? It was then that a bold and unexpected idea popped into Eris' mind. He sat up straighter, his eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. What if I disguised myself? He proposed, his voice low but intense. As someone from outside the community. A driver, perhaps. That would give me access to people and places I wouldn't normally have. Rivka gasped, shocked by the suggestion. Ari, you can't be serious. This goes against everything we believe in. Ari took her hands in his eyes pleading for understanding. I know, my love. Believe me, I understand how radical it sounds. But think about it. If there's a secret that could affect our family, our community, don't we have a moral obligation to discover it? Rivka was silent for a long moment, her face a mixture of conflicting emotions. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. What if what we find out changes everything? Ari swallowed, feeling the weight of her decision. Then, well, deal with it. Together, as we always have. With a shaky sigh, Rivka nodded. May Hashem guide and protect us on this journey. Ari hugged her tightly, feeling her heart beating against his. As they stood there, enveloped in the silence of the night, they both knew that they were about to embark on a journey that could change their lives forever. As sleep finally enveloped them, Ari couldn't help but wonder about the ramifications of his decision. He was about to plunge into an unknown world, leaving behind the safety and comfort of everything he knew. What would he discover? And, more importantly, would he be prepared to face the truth, whatever it might be? With these questions echoing in his mind, Ari fell asleep, unaware that his search for the truth was about to unleash a series of events that would test his faith, his love, and everything he believed to be true about his family and his heritage. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. The soft sound of scissors cutting hair echoed in the silent bathroom. Ari, standing in front of the mirror, watched with a mixture of fascination and apprehension as Rivka carefully trimmed his beard. Wisps of dark hair fell into the sink, each one representing years of devotion and tradition. Are you sure about this, Ari? Rivka asked, her voice trembling. Her eyes met his in the reflection, full of concern. Ari swallowed, feeling the weight of his decision. Yes, he replied, his voice firmer than he felt. It's necessary. As the beard grew shorter, Ari felt as if he was losing a part of himself. Each snip of the scissors seemed to rip away not just hair, but years of his identity. When Rivka finished, with the shave, she hesitated, the scissors hovering near the payout the side curls that were such a visible symbol of her faith. Do it, Ari said softly, closing her eyes. With trembling hands, Rivka cut the curls. The sound seemed deafening in the silence of the bathroom. When she had finished, Ari opened his eyes slowly, almost afraid to face his reflection. The man staring back at him was a stranger. No beard, no payot. His face looked naked, vulnerable. Ari touched his smooth cheek, feeling the exposed skin for the first time in decades. It's still you, Rivka whispered, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Inside, where it really matters. Ari nodded, unable to speak. He knew that this external transformation was only the beginning. The real challenge would be to maintain his inner identity while navigating a world he had long since left behind. The next morning, Ari found himself in front of an employment agency in the center of Jerusalem. Dressed in ordinary pants and a button-down shirt, he felt exposed, as if everyone could see through his disguise. Next, called out the attendant, a young woman with dyed red hair and several piercings. Ari approached the counter, his heart pounding. Good morning, he said, his voice huskier than usual. I'm looking for a job as a driver. The attendant looked at him curiously. "Experience? I've been driving for years," Ari replied, feeling uncomfortable with the half-truth. After filling in a few forms and undergoing a brief interview, Ari left the agency with the promise of a test job the following week. As he walked through the busy streets, he felt overwhelmed by the sounds and sights of the secular city. Women in clothes he would consider inappropriate, men without kippas, the tantalizing aroma of non-kosher food, it all assaulted him, reminding him of how sheltered his world had been. A few days later, Ari found himself behind the wheel of a cab, nervous but determined. His first passenger, a hurried businessman, barely looked at him as he got into the car. "Ben Gurion Airport, please," the man said, his eyes fixed on his smartphone. Ari nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as he maneuvered the car into traffic. As he drove, he was surprised at how easily the conversations flowed. Passengers shared stories, gossip, and opinions freely, often forgetting that anyone was listening. At the end of his first day, Ari returned home exhausted, but with his mind spinning. The world beyond his community was vast and complex, full of contradictions and nuances he had never considered before. It was during his third week as a driver that Ari got his first glimpse of the mystery he was trying to unravel. He had picked up an elderly passenger, a distinguished-looking man called Ephraim, who asked to be taken to a cemetery on the outskirts of the city. During the journey, Ephraim started talking about the old days in Jerusalem. The city has changed so much, he sighed, especially after that terrible incident in the 70s. Ari, his interest piqued, asked casually, "What incident?" Ephraim looked at him in surprise. "You don't know? The fire in the Beit Yaakov synagogue. It was a scandal at the time. It divided the community." Ari's heart raced. He had never heard of this fire before. "What happened?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Oh, it's a sad story," Ephraim replied, his voice lowering. "There have been accusations of insurance fraud, suspicions of the involvement of respected members of the community. Some say it was an accident, others believe it was something worse." Ari felt a chill run down his spine. Could there be a connection between this incident and the secret his family was hiding? When they arrived at the cemetery, Ephraim paid for the ride and got out of the car. Before pulling away, he turned and said, "You know, it's funny. You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago, a man called Goldstein. He was at the center of all that mess." With those words, Ephraim drove away, leaving Ari stunned. In the driver's seat, Goldstein his own surname. Could it be a coincidence? That night, Ari could hardly sleep. His mind was full of questions. What role could his grandfather have played in this mysterious fire? Why had his family never mentioned it? Lying next to Rivka, who was sleeping peacefully, Ari realized that he was only scratching the surface of a secret much deeper and potentially more dangerous than he had ever imagined. As the sun rose, bringing with it a new day, Ari made a decision. He needed to go deeper, to investigate further. No matter the cost, he would discover the truth about his family's past and the role they played in this mysterious event. With renewed determination, Ari stood up, ready to face another day in his disguise. Little did he know that every step he took towards the truth would bring him closer to a confrontation that would test not only his faith, but also everything he believed about his family and his community. As he prepared for another day as a driver, Ari couldn't help but ask himself, how far was he willing to go to find out the truth? And, more importantly, would he be prepared for the consequences when he finally found it? The sun had barely risen when Ari started the engine of his cab, the first rays of the morning reflecting on the windshield. His eyes, tired from a bad night's sleep, were full of determination. Today, he decided, would be different. He would no longer wait for information to come to him. It was time to actively seek it out. As he drove through the streets that were beginning to wake up, Ari worked out his plan. He would focus on older passengers, those who might have memories of the incident mentioned by Ephraim. Carefully, he would ask seemingly innocent questions. gently probing into the community's past. His first passenger of the day was an elderly woman, her grey hair carefully arranged under a colourful scarf. She got into the cab with a kind smile. "Good morning," Ari greeted, his heart racing slightly. "Where are we going today?" "Oh, to Mahane Yehuda Market, please," she replied, settling into the seat. While driving, Ari began casually. "You know, I'm new in town. I've heard that Jerusalem has changed a lot in the last few decades. You must have seen a lot of changes, haven't you?" The lady smiled, her eyes sparkling with memories. "Oh yes, young man. So many changes. Some good, some... Well, not so much." Ari saw his opportunity. "I imagine there must have been difficult times too. I heard about a fire in a synagogue many years ago." The lady's smile disappeared, replaced by a somber expression. "Ah, yes, the fire at Beit Yaakov. A sad day for all of us." "What exactly happened?" Ari asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The lady hesitated, looking out of the window for a moment before answering. "Nobody knows for sure. There were many rumors, accusations. Some families have never recovered from the scandal." Ari felt a knot in his stomach. "What kind of accusations?" "It's better not to talk about it," she said, her voice lowering. "Some stories are better left in the past." The rest of the journey passed in silence, leaving Ari with more questions than answers. As the day progressed, he continued his subtle investigation, collecting snippets of information from various passengers. Each conversation added a piece to the puzzle, but the full picture remained obscure. At the end of his shift, Ari parked the cab and walked to a nearby public library. It was uncharted territory for him, a place he had rarely visited in his previous life. The smell of old books and the respectful silence enveloped him as he made his way to the old periodicals section. With slightly trembling hands, Ari began to search through the newspaper archives from the 1970s. Page after page, he rummaged through, his eyes searching for any mention of the Beit Yaakov synagogue fire. Finally, almost at the end of his search, he found it. A small article, almost hidden on page 7 of a newspaper, from 1972 suspicious fire at Beit Yaakov synagogue in the early hours of yesterday morning. A fire devastated the historic Beit Yaakov synagogue. Authorities suspect possible insurance fraud. Among those investigated is prominent community member Yehuda Goldstein. Ari felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Yehuda Goldstein, his grandfather, the man he had always seen as a pillar of integrity and faith. How could this be possible? With trembling hands, Ari made a copy of the article and hurried out of the library, his mind in turmoil. The streets of Jerusalem seemed strange now, as if the city he knew so well had been transformed into something alien and threatening. When he finally arrived home, Ari found Rivka in the kitchen preparing dinner. She looked at him, immediately realizing that something was wrong. "Ari, what happened?" He didn't answer immediately, unable to find the words. How could he explain that the foundation of his family, of his identity, was potentially built on a lie? "Rivka," he began, his voice hoarse, "I found something about my grandfather." She moved closer, concern evident in her eyes. "What did you find?" Ari handed her the copy of the article, watching as she read, her eyes wide with shock. That can't be true," Rivka whispered, looking at Ari for confirmation, for denial, for anything that could make sense of this terrible new knowledge. "I don't know," Ari replied, feeling lost. "But I need to find out." Rivka placed the article on the table, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "Ari, this is dangerous. What if it destroys everything we have?" Ari took her hands in his, feeling the trembling in his fingers. "What if we don't find out? Can we live with that doubt?" The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of decisions not made and truths not yet faced. In the days that followed, Ari intensified his search. Every spare moment was dedicated to investigating, digging through archives, discreetly talking to older members of the community. His double life was beginning to take its toll. At home, he had become distant, preoccupied. At work as a driver, every conversation was a potential opportunity for more information. It was during one of these conversations that Ari made his most shocking discovery yet. His passenger was a retired lawyer, a serious-looking man with piercing eyes behind thick glasses. "The fire at Beit Yaakov," the lawyer repeated when Ari casually brought up the subject. "Ah, yes, a fascinating case. It was never officially solved, you know." Ari felt his heart racing. "What do you mean?" The lawyer leaned forward, lowering his voice as if he were sharing a secret. There was a trial, of course, but it was all hushed up. The judge closed the case abruptly, citing lack of evidence. But there were rumors. "What kind of rumors?" Ari asked, barely managing to keep his voice steady. "That someone very powerful was involved. Someone with connections both in the community and outside it. The kind of person who could make a case disappear." Ari felt a chill run down his spine. "What about the accused? What happened to them?" The lawyer shrugged. "Some have left town, others went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. It's amazing what money and influence can do." When the lawyer got out of the cab, Ari sat for a long moment, unable to move. The implication was clear. It wasn't just his grandfather who was potentially involved, but a whole network of powerful and influential people. With trembling hands, Ari picked up his phone and dialed Rivka's number. "We need to talk," he said as soon as she picked up. "I've found something. Something big." As he drove home, Ari couldn't help thinking about the ramifications of his discovery. Who else in her community, in her own family, could be involved in this cover-up? And how far would they go to keep their secrets buried? As the sun set over Jerusalem, casting long shadows across the ancient streets, Ari realized that he had crossed a point of no return. There was no going back to the comfortable ignorance of his previous life. The truth, however painful, had to be revealed. With renewed determination, he sped towards home, knowing that the revelations he was about to share with Rivka would change their lives forever. The road ahead was uncertain and potentially dangerous, but Ari knew he had no choice but to keep going no matter the cost. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. The morning air was cool when Ari parked his cab in front of a small park in the heart of Jerusalem. His tired eyes fixed on a modest stone memorial, almost hidden among the trees. With hesitant steps, he approached, his heart beating hard in his chest. In memory of the victims of the Beit Yaakov synagogue fire, 1972 read the simple inscription. Ari stood there, motionless, absorbing the weight of those words. Until a few days ago, this memorial had meant nothing to him. Now, it carried the weight of family secrets and a dark history that threatened to crumble everything he believed in. As he gazed at the monument, an elderly voice surprised him. "It's not often you see young people around here," said a gray-haired man, leaning on a cane. "Especially so early." Ari turned, meeting the man's tired but perceptive eyes. I'm trying to understand what happened," he replied hesitantly. The old man nodded slowly. "Ah, the fire. A dark day for our community. I was there, you know. I saw the flames consume years of history and faith." Ari's heart raced. "Can you tell me more?" The man, who introduced himself as Shmuel, sat down on a nearby bench, inviting Ari to join him. In a low voice heavy with memories, Shmuel began to recount the events of that fateful night. It was late at night. The alarm went off, and when we arrived, the synagogue was already on fire. We tried to save what we could, Torahs, holy books, but the fire, it was as if it had a life of its own. Ari listened attentively, absorbing every word. "And then what? What happened?" Shmuel's eyes clouded over. The accusations began. Insurance fraud, some said. Others spoke of revenge, of old disputes in the community. Families that had been close for generations suddenly became enemies. What about the investigation? Ari pressed gently. Shmuel let out a tired sigh. It was a circus, influential people being interrogated, expensive lawyers in and out of court. And then suddenly, everything stopped, as if someone had closed the curtains on a stage. Ari felt a knot in his stomach, and people just accepted that. What could we do? Shmuel shrugged. Some protested, demanded answers. But over time, well, life goes on. People choose to forget what is too painful to remember. When Shmuel got up to leave, he put a hand on Ari's shoulder. Young man, sometimes the past is best left where it is. Some truths are too heavy to carry. Ari watched the old man walk away, feeling the weight of those words. But he knew he couldn't stop now. The truth, no matter how painful, had to be uncovered. That evening, Ari arrived home later than usual. The house was silent, the children already in bed. He found Rivka in the living room, a book open on her lap, but her eyes were distant, lost in thought. "How was your day?" she asked softly when she saw him enter. Ari sat down next to her, feeling the weight of his discoveries. "Rivka, I visited the memorial today, and I talked to someone who was there the night of the fire." Rivka closed the book, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "And what did you find out?" Ari shared what Shmuel had told him, watching his wife's face as she spoke. She saw pain, fear, and something else, a determination that mirrored her own. "Ari," Rivka said after a long silence, "have you ever considered that maybe it's better not to know, that some truths can do more harm than good?" Ari took her hands in his. "I've thought about it, believe me. But how can we live with this doubt? How can we look at our children and know that we're perpetuating a lie?" Rivka squeezed his hands. "What if the truth is worse than we imagined? What if it destroys not just our family but the whole community?" "What if we do nothing?" Ari replied, his voice low but firm. "If we allow these secrets to continue to poison our lives, our traditions." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with decisions not made and paths not yet chosen. Finally, Rivka spoke. "What do you intend to do now?" Ari took a deep breath. "I need to dig deeper. There are archives, records that I haven't yet consulted, and I think it's time to confront some older members of the family." Rivka nodded slowly. "Be careful, Ari. You're messing with forces we don't fully understand." That night, lying side by side in the darkness, they both lay awake, their minds filled with unanswered questions and unspoken fears. The next morning, Ari found himself in front of his grandmother Sarah's house. It was a modest but well-kept building with a small garden in front. His hands trembled slightly as he knocked on the door. Sarah welcomed him with a warm smile, although her eyes betrayed slight confusion. "Ari, what are you doing here so early? And what happened to your beard?" Ari forced a smile. "Grandma, I need to talk to you about something important. About Grandpa Yehuda." Sarah's smile faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Of course, come in. He'll make some tea." While Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, Ari looked around the living room. Family photos adorned the walls and shelves. His eyes settled on an old photo of his grandfather, Yehuda, a tall, imposing man, with piercing eyes that seemed to look straight into the soul. Sarah returned with 2 cups of tea and sat down next to Ari on the sofa. "So, what do you want to know about your grandfather?" Ari took a deep breath. "Grandma, I found out something about the fire at the Beit Yaakov synagogue. Grandpa's name was mentioned in the investigation." Sarah's face paled, and for a moment, Ari thought she was going to faint. But then a fierce determination took over her eyes. "Who told you that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I read it in an old article," Ari replied. "Grandma, please, I need to know the truth. What really happened that night?" Sarah was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on a distant point. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Your grandfather, he was a complicated man, Ari. Dedicated to our community, yes, but also ambitious. There were pressures, debts you can't imagine." Ari felt his heart squeeze. Did he really have anything to do with the fire? Sarah closed her eyes, a solitary tear running down her wrinkled cheek. Not directly, but he knew. He knew something was going to happen, and he didn't do anything to stop it. The revelation hit Ari like a punch in the gut. He stood up abruptly, walking over to the window, trying to process what he had just heard. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't he do anything?" "Fear, Ari," Sarah replied softly. "Afraid of losing everything. And then? Well, then it was the fear of the truth that consumed him." Ari turned to her grandmother, seeing for the first time not only the strong woman she had always admired, but also someone who had carried a terrible weight for decades. "There's more," Sarah continued, standing up with difficulty. "Your grandfather, he kept a diary. In the last years of his life, he wrote everything down. I think it was his way of confessing, of trying to make peace with the past." She walked over to an old cupboard, opening a hidden drawer. From there, she pulled out a worn, leather-bound book. "Here," she said, holding out the diary to Ari. "Maybe this can answer the questions I can't." With trembling hands, Ari took the diary. He could feel the weight of the story, of the secrets contained in those pages. "Ari," Sarah said, her voice suddenly urgent, "be careful. There are people who would do anything to keep these secrets buried. Your grandfather, he wasn't the only one involved." Ari nodded gravely, understanding the seriousness of the warning. As he left his grandmother's house, the diary hidden in his jacket, he knew he had crossed a point of no return. The truth was within his grasp, but the path to it would be dangerous and potentially devastating. With a heavy heart, but determined, Ari got into his cab. The working day awaited him, but his mind was focused on what he would do when he got home. His grandfather's diary was the key to unlocking the mystery, but it could also be Pandora's box which, once opened, would unleash unimaginable consequences. As he drove through the familiar streets of Jerusalem, Ari wondered if he was prepared for the revelations that awaited him and the impact they would have not only on his life, but on that of his entire community. Ari's heart was pounding in his chest as he silently climbed the stairs to his grandmother Sarah's house. It was almost midnight, and the house was plunged into a sepulchral silence. He knew that what he was about to do was wrong on so many levels, but the need to discover the truth drove him forward. With careful steps, Ari reached the second floor. The occasional creak of the wooden floor made his heart leap, fearful of waking his grandmother. He stopped for a moment in front of her bedroom door, listening to her soft, rhythmic breathing. Satisfied that she was sound asleep, Ari continued towards the study at the end of the corridor. The moonlight coming through the window provided enough illumination for him to navigate the room. His eyes roamed the shelves full of books, the antique furniture, looking for any sign of his grandfather's diary. He began rummaging through drawers, trying to make as little noise as possible. Minutes passed, seeming like hours. Frustration grew in Ari as each drawer and cupboard proved empty of its prize. He was about to give up when he noticed something strange, a small discrepancy in the wooden panel behind the desk. With trembling fingers, Ari pressed the panel, feeling it give way slightly. A soft click echoed in the silence, and a secret compartment opened up. There, hidden from view for decades, was his grandfather's diary. Ari took the book reverently, feeling the weight of its secrets. He was about to open it when he heard a noise coming from the corridor. She froze, her heart racing, as footsteps approached. "Ari!" His grandmother's voice, sleepy and confused, reached him. "Is that you there?" Panicked, Ari quickly hid the diary inside his jacket and closed the secret compartment. He barely had time to move away from the desk before the door opened, revealing Sarah in her robe, her eyes half closed with sleep. "What are you doing here so late?" she asked, confusion giving way to suspicion in her voice. Ari swallowed, her mind racing to find a plausible explanation. I couldn't sleep, Grandma. I was thinking about Grandpa and I just wanted to feel his presence, you know." Sarah's face softened, a mixture of understanding and sadness in her eyes. "Oh, Ari, your grandfather would have been happy to know that you were thinking of him. But it's late, dear. Go home, get some rest." Ari nodded, feeling guilty for lying, but relieved that he hadn't been caught. As he left the house, the diary weighed heavily on his chest, both physically and metaphorically. Back in his apartment, Ari closed the office door, isolating himself from the rest of the sleeping house. With trembling hands, he opened his grandfather's diary, feeling as if he was about to open a Pandora's box. The first few pages were innocent. Enough reflections on daily life, thoughts on family and community. But as Ari progressed, the tone began to change. His grandfather wrote about financial pressures, difficult decisions, and moral compromises. And then, there it was. The entry dated a week before the fire at the Beit Yaakov synagogue. "The plan is in motion. May Jid forgive me, but I see no other way out. The debts are too great, the threats too real. If I don't do this, we'll lose everything. But the price is too high." Ari felt his stomach turn. His grandfather's words confirmed his worst suspicions. Yehuda Goldstein didn't just know about the plan to burn down the synagogue, he was part of it. The following pages detailed her grandfather's anguish, his internal conflict, the sleepless nights tormented by guilt. Ari read with a mixture of horror and compassion, watching the man he had admired all his life crumble under the weight of his actions. One passage in particular hit him like a punch in the gut. The fire was much worse than we imagined. No one should have been hurt, but now there's blood on my hands. How can I look my family in the eye, knowing what I've done? How can I lead my community carrying this secret? Ari closed the diary, feeling nauseous. The truth he had sought so much now seemed like a curse. His grandfather, the man he saw as a pillar of integrity and faith, had been complicit in a terrible act that had cost innocent lives. It was dawn when Ari finally left the office, his eyes red from reading and crying. He found Rivka in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the children. She looked at him, immediately realizing that something was wrong. "Ari, were you up all night?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. He nodded, unable to find words at the moment. The children, sensing the tension in the air, ate quickly and left for school, leaving Ari and Rivka alone. "What happened?" Rivka asked, as soon as the door closed behind her children. Ari put the diary on the kitchen table. "I found it. My grandfather's diary." Rivka looked at the book as if it were a bomb about to explode. It's true. All of it. The fire. The cover-up. My grandfather. He was involved, Rivka. He knew it was going to happen and did nothing to stop it. Rivka fell heavily into a chair, the shock evident on her face. "Oh, Ari! What do we do now?" Ari asked, her voice broken. "How can we live with this? How can we look at our community knowing what we know?" Rivka was silent for a long moment, processing everything. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, but gentle. "Ari, your grandfather made a terrible mistake, but he also suffered from it for the rest of his life. The question now is, what are you going to do with this information?" Ari looked at her, feeling lost. "I don't know. Part of me wants to reveal everything, to clear the names of the people wrongly accused. But another part fears the consequences. For our family, for the whole community." Rivka took his hands in hers. This is a decision that only you can make, Ari. But remember, the truth has the power to liberate, but also to destroy. Think carefully about what is really right, not just for the past, but for the present and the future. Ari nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. He knew he was facing a moral crossroads, a choice that would define not only his own character, but the fate of many others. As the sun rose in the Jerusalem sky, illuminating the kitchen with its golden light, Ari and Rivka sat in silence, the diary between them like a silent testimony to the secrets of the past and the choices that were yet to come. Ari knew that, whatever her decision, nothing would ever be the same. The truth, once known, could not be unknown. Now he had to decide whether to be the guardian of that secret, or the herald of a truth that could shake the foundations of everything he loved. The sun had barely risen when Ari left the house, the weight of his grandfather's diary seeming to pull him to the ground with every step. The streets of Jerusalem, normally vibrant at that time of the morning, seemed strangely silent, as if the city itself was holding its breath, awaiting his decision. Ari walked aimlessly for hours, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Rivka's words echoed in his head. The truth has the power to liberate, but also to destroy. He knew he was facing a choice that would change not only his life, but potentially that of his entire community. His steps led him, almost unconsciously, to the memorial to the Beit Yaakov fire. There, in front of the simple stone plaque, Ari finally stopped. His eyes ran over the names of the victims, each one now carrying an additional weight in his heart. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "You deserve justice." It was at that moment, with the morning sun finally breaking, through the clouds and bathing the memorial in a golden light, that Ari made his decision. He could no longer carry this secret. The truth, no matter how painful, had to come out. With renewed determination, Ari picked up his phone and made a call that he knew would change everything. "Rabbi Levi, this is Ari Goldstein. We need to talk. It's about the Beit Yaakov fire." Rabbi Levis' office was a cozy space, filled with old books and the comforting scent of mint tea. The rabbi, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gray beard, listened in silence as Ari revealed everything he had discovered. When Ari finished, showing him his grandfather's diary, Rabbi Levi let out a long sigh. "Ari," he said softly, "do you understand what you're doing by bringing this to light after so many years?" Ari nodded, his expression a mixture of determination and fear. "I know it can destroy reputations, even families, but how can we go on living with this lie?" Rabbi Levi was silent for a moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the table. "There's something you need to know," he said at last. "Your grandfather wasn't the only one involved in this incident." Ari felt his heart race. "What do you mean?" "The Beit Yaakov fire was just the tip of the iceberg," the rabbi explained, his voice low and serious. "There was a group, powerful people in the community involved in questionable activities, fraud, money laundering, even connections to organized crime." Ari felt as if the ground was opening up under his feet. "And you knew about this all along?" Rabbi Levi nodded sadly. "Some of us knew, yes, but to expose everything would have destroyed our community. So we did what we thought was best. We kept quiet and tried to guide our people back to the right path." Ari stood up abruptly, anger and frustration bubbling in his chest. "What about the victims, the people who died in that fire? Didn't they deserve justice?" "Ari," the rabbi said, his voice heavy with regret, "sometimes there are no easy choices. Only difficult choices, and even more difficult choices." Leaving the rabbi's office, Ari felt as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The truth he was seeking was far greater and more complex than he had ever imagined. As he walked through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, Ari noticed something strange. People were watching him, some with curiosity, others with something that looked like fear. A man he had known for years quickly crossed the street to avoid him. Confused and disturbed, Ari hurried home. As he turned a corner, he almost collided with Moshe, an old friend of his father. "Ari," Moshe said, his voice tense. "Is it true what they're saying? That you're digging up the past, asking questions about the fire?" Ari felt a chill run down his spine. "How did you—" Moshe looked around nervously before approaching. "Listen, my boy. You need to stop this. There are things that are better left buried. Powerful people, dangerous people, are involved." "But the truth," Ari began. But Moshe interrupted him. "The truth?" He laughed bitterly. "The truth can be a dangerous weapon, Ari. Think about your family, your position in the community. Is it worth risking all that?" Before Ari could answer, Moshe quickly walked away, leaving him alone with his swirling thoughts. Arriving home, Ari found Rivka waiting for him, her face pale with worry. "Ari," she said as soon as he entered, "I received a strange phone call today. Someone warned us to be careful. They say you're messing with dangerous things." Ari felt the blood freeze in his veins. He told Rivka about his conversation with Rabbi Levi and the meeting with Moshe. "This is bigger than we imagined, Rivka," he said, sinking into the sofa. "It's not just about my grandfather or the fire. There's a whole network of corruption and secrets." Rivka sat down next to him, taking his hands in hers. "What are we going to do now?" Ari looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes, but also the strength and love. He knew that, whatever his decision, she would be by his side. "We can't back down now," he finally said. "If we stop, we'll be just as guilty as those who committed the original crimes. We have to go all the way, no matter what the cost." Rivka nodded slowly. "I'm with you, Ari. But I fear for the children, for our safety." Ari hugged her tightly, feeling the trembling in her body. "We'll take all the necessary precautions. But we can't live with this lie, Rivka. We can't let evil continue to thrive in the shadow of silence." That night, as the Goldstein family prepared for bed, an atmosphere of tension hung over the house. Ari checked and reinforced all the locks, keeping his grandfather's diary close at hand. Lying in bed, unable to sleep, Ari knew he had crossed a point of no return. The search for the truth now put him on a collision course not only with the past, but with powerful and dangerous forces in the present. As the clock ticked into the early hours of the morning, Ari made a silent promise to himself, and to the victims of the past he would go all the way, no matter the cost. The truth, buried for so long, would finally come to light. What Ari didn't know was that in the shadows, other forces were already moving. The battle for truth and justice was just beginning, and the price to be paid could be greater than he had ever imagined. The shrill ring of the telephone woke Ari in the middle of the night. He groped around in the dark, his heart racing as his fingers found the handset. "Hello?" His voice was hoarse with sleep. "Mr. Goldstein," a distorted voice answered. "This is your last chance. Stop digging into the past, or there will be consequences." Before Ari could reply, the line went silent. Beside her, Rivka stirred, waking up. "Who was that?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Ari swallowed. "Someone who doesn't want us to continue our investigation." In the days that followed, the tension in the community was palpable. Ari noticed furtive glances and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached. In his work as a driver, some regular passengers suddenly found other transportation options. One afternoon, as Ari walked home after his shift, he noticed a dark car slowly following him. The vehicle kept a constant distance, but its presence was undeniable. Ari hurried his pace, his heart hammering in his chest. When he finally arrived home and closed the door behind him, he allowed himself to breathe. Rivka met him in the living room, her face pale. "Ari," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Something strange happened today. A man came into the store. He didn't buy anything. He just kept looking around and asking questions about our family." Ari felt a shiver run down her spine. The threats were becoming bolder, more direct. He hugged Rivka, feeling her tremble. "Maybe we should stop, Rivka," whispered against his chest. "It's too dangerous." Ari closed his eyes, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. But then the image of the fire victims flashed into his mind. "We can't," he replied softly. "If we stop now, they'll win, and the truth will be buried forever." The next morning, Ari received a cryptic message: "Meet me at Café Nevo at noon. Come alone. L." Intrigued and cautious, Ari decided to go. Café Nevo was a busy place in the center of Jerusalem, public enough to be safe, but with discreet corners for private conversations. Upon arriving, Ari immediately spotted Rabbi Levi sitting in a far corner. The elderly man nodded discreetly, indicating that Ari should join him. "Thank you for coming," the rabbi said quietly as soon as Ari sat down. "I've been thinking a lot about our previous conversation, and there's something I need to show you." The rabbi slid a brown envelope across the table. Ari opened it carefully, his eyes widening as he saw its contents: old photos, financial documents, even a list of names, some of which he recognized as prominent members of the community. "What's this?" Ari asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Evidence," the rabbi replied gravely. "I've been guarding it for years, waiting for the right moment. Perhaps that moment is now." Ari looked at the old man, a mixture of gratitude and confusion in his eyes. "Why are you showing me this now?" Rabbi Levi sighed deeply. "Because you had the courage to do what many of us feared, and because I'm tired of carrying this burden. The truth needs to come out, no matter what the cost." As they discussed the documents in hushed tones, Ari felt a presence behind him. Turning around, he saw a familiar face. It was Shmuel, the survivor of the fire with whom he had spoken weeks ago. "Forgive me for intruding," Shmuel said, his voice shaking with emotion, "but I couldn't help overhearing. If you're looking for the truth about the fire, I want to help." With the unexpected help of Rabbi Levi and Shmuel, Eris' investigation gained momentum. In the days that followed, they worked tirelessly, connecting dots, digging up old records and taking statements from reluctant witnesses. But as they progressed, the pressure on Ari and his family increased. One night, they arrived home to find the door kicked in, drawers rifled through. Nothing had been stolen, but the message was clear: they were being watched. On another occasion, Ari's eldest son came home from school with a black eye. "Some boys said that my father is a traitor," he sobbed, "that we're bringing shame on the community." Ari felt his heart break. He hugged his son, fighting back tears. "Sometimes," he said softly, "doing the right thing is hard, but that doesn't mean we have to stop." The tension reached its peak when Ari received an anonymous call late at night. The voice on the other end was cold, calculating. "Mr. Goldstein, your persistence is admirable, but foolish. We have an offer for you. Tomorrow, at 10 p.m., in the old cemetery. Come alone. This is your last chance to protect your family." Ari felt a chill run down his spine. He knew it was a trap, but he also knew he couldn't ignore the threat. Rivka, hearing about the ultimatum, grabbed Ari's arm. "You can't go," she begged, tears in her eyes. "It's too dangerous." Ari hugged her tightly, feeling her trembling. "If I don't go, they'll never leave us alone. I have to face them. Put an end to this once and for all." That night, as he prepared for the meeting, Ari reflected on his journey. What had begun as a personal quest for the truth had turned into something much bigger. He was no longer just fighting for his grandfather's legacy. but for the integrity of an entire community. With trembling hands, Ari took his grandfather's diary and the documents provided by Rabbi Levi. He put them in a folder, along with a letter he had written, a full confession of everything he had discovered, addressed to the authorities should anything happen to him. Before leaving, Ari hugged Rivka and the children one last time. "I promise. I'll be back," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. As he walked towards the cemetery, the cold Jerusalem night enveloping him like a cloak, Ari felt the weight of generations on his shoulders. He was about to confront not only the ghosts of the past, but also the shadows of the present that had manipulated and controlled his community for so long. The rusty cemetery gate creaked ominously as Ari pushed it open. The ancient tombstones cast grotesque shadows in the moonlight. His heart pounded as he advanced, his eyes scanning the darkness. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence. "Welcome, Mr. Goldstein. We've been expecting you." Ari turned around, facing three figures emerging from the shadows. He recognized one. Of them, it was one of the community's most respected elders. "It's time we put an end to this," the elder said, his voice laden with menace. One way or another, Ari swallowed, realizing that he had reached the crux of his journey. What happened next would determine not only his fate, but the future of the entire community. With a deep breath, he prepared himself for the confrontation that would change everything. The sun had barely risen when Ari woke up, his body aching and his mind in turmoil after the confrontation in the cemetery. The old man's words were still ringing in his ears. "You have until tomorrow night to hand over all the evidence and end this madness, or you will face the consequences." Sitting at the kitchen table, an untouched cup of coffee in front of him, Ari mentally went over his options. Handing over the evidence would mean the end of his search for the truth, but it would guarantee his family's safety. Continuing meant risking everything, but with the chance of finally exposing decades of lies and corruption. Rivka entered the kitchen, her tired eyes reflecting sleepless nights. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice a mixture of concern and determination. Ari took a deep breath. "We need to prepare. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Ari made discreet calls to Rabbi Levi and Shmuel, organizing a secret meeting. Meanwhile, Rivka prepared a small suitcase with essential items in case they needed to leave town in a hurry. In the afternoon, Ari met with his allies in a discreet cafe on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Rabbi Levi, his face marked with concern, brought more documents. "These are the latest records I've managed to gather," he said, handing Ari a folder. "There's evidence of suspicious financial transactions, links to underworld figures, all dating back decades until recently." Shmuel, the fire survivor, added, "And I've finally convinced other survivors to talk. They're willing to testify about what really happened that night." Ari felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. This is more than I expected, but it also makes us even bigger targets. Rabbi Levi nodded gravely. "That's why we need to act quickly." Tomorrow night, during the community council meeting, we'll expose everything. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the cobbled streets of Jerusalem, Ari prepared for the meeting that could change everything. He checked the folder with all the evidence once more, making sure that every document was in order. Rivka watched him from the doorway, her face a mask of concern. "Are you sure you want to do this alone? I could go with you." Ari shook his head. "It's too risky. Besides, I need you to stay with the children, if anything goes wrong." He couldn't finish the sentence, but Rivka understood. She came closer, hugging him tightly. "Come back to me," she whispered. With one last look at his home, at his family, Ari set off towards the meeting place, an old building in the heart of the Jewish quarter, where the community council used to meet. The streets were strangely deserted as he walked, the tension palpable in the air. As he approached the building, Ari saw a solitary figure waiting at the entrance. It was Moshe, his father's old friend who had warned him weeks ago. "Ari," Moshe said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Please reconsider." There's still time to turn back. Ari looked into the older man's eyes, seeing fear, but also a spark of hope. "I can't, Moshe. We've come too far to stop now." Moshe nodded slowly. "Then may God be with you." And, to Ari's surprise, he opened the door, allowing her to enter. The meeting hall was lit only by a few old lamps, creating a gloomy atmosphere. Around a large wooden table, Ari recognized the faces of the community leaders, including the elder who had confronted him in the cemetery. "Welcome, Mr. Goldstein," the elder said, his voice cold. "I hope you've made the right decision." Ari placed his briefcase on the table. "I've made my decision," he replied, his voice firm. "I'm here to expose the truth, the whole truth." A murmur ran through the room. Some faces showed anger, others fear, and some relief. Ari began to speak, his voice gaining strength as he recounted his journey, from the discovery of his grandfather's diary to the evidence of decades of corruption and cover-up. The Beit Yaakov fire was no accident, he declared. It was the result of years of fraud, greed, and abuse of power. And it wasn't just a few people involved, but an entire network that stretches to this day. He began to present the evidence: financial documents, witness statements, even taped confessions. With each new revelation, the shock and disbelief on the faces around the table deepened. When Ari finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. It was Rabbi Levi who broke it, standing up slowly. "As one of the few who has known the truth for all these years," he said, his voice trembling, "I must confess my guilt in keeping silent. But now, thanks to Ari's courage, we have the chance to do what is right." One of the younger members of the council, with tears in his eyes, asked, "What do we do now?" Ari took a deep breath. "We hand everything over to the authorities. We compensate the victims and their families. And most importantly, we rebuild our community on a foundation of honesty and integrity." The old man, who had remained silent until then, stood up abruptly. "This will destroy everything we've worked for. Generations of reputation, of influence."
"A reputation built on lies is worth nothing," Ari retorted. "And what kind of example are we setting for generations to come if we continue to perpetuate this farce?" The tension in the room was palpable. Ari could sense that they were on the verge of a crucial turning point.
Everything depended on what would happen in the next few moments. It was then that the door suddenly opened. Everyone turned, surprised, to see Rivka entering, followed by Shmuel and other survivors of the fire. "Sorry we're late," Rivka said, her voice firm. "But we thought it was important that all voices were heard tonight." Shmuel stepped forward, his eyes scanning the faces around the table. "For decades, we have carried the weight of that night. We lost friends, family, our faith in the community that was supposed to protect us. It's time for the truth to come out." One by one, the survivors began to tell their stories. Accounts of loss, of pain, but also of an unshakable hope for justice. As the stories unfolded, Ari saw something change in the eyes of the council members. Fear and resistance began to give way to shame, regret, and finally, determination. When the last survivor had finished speaking, the elder, with tears in his eyes, slowly stood up. "May God forgive us for what we have done," he said, his voice broken. "And may He give us the strength to mend what we have broken." At that moment, Ari knew that they had reached a turning point. The truth, buried for so long, had finally come to light. The road ahead would be difficult, painful, but necessary. As the meeting dissolved, with plans being made for the next steps, Ari found himself next to Rivka, their hands intertwined. "How did you know?" he asked softly. Rivka smiled softly. "I know you, Ari. I knew you'd do the right thing. I just thought you might need a little extra support." Ari hugged her, feeling the weight of the last few months finally begin to dissipate. As he looked around the room, seeing faces marked by revelation, but also by hope, he knew that this was only the beginning. The journey to rebuild his community, to heal old wounds and forge a new path, was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, Ari felt real hope for the future. The sun rose over Jerusalem, bathing the ancient city in a golden light that contrasted dramatically with the palpable tension in the air. Ari Goldstein adjusted his tie, looking at himself in the mirror one last time before leaving. Today was the day that would change everything. The courtroom was packed when Ari arrived, accompanied by Rivka and his closest allies, Rabbi Levi and Shmuel. Reporters crowded around the entrance, their cameras snapping incessantly. Ari noticed familiar faces from the community mingling with the crowd, some avoiding his gaze, others offering discreet nods of support. Inside the courtroom, the air was charged with expectation. In the dock, Ari saw the faces of the accused community leaders, respected businessmen, even a local politician. Their gazes ranged from defiance to fear and, in some cases, sorrowful resignation. When the judge entered, a sepulchral silence fell over the room. "We are here today," he began, his deep voice echoing, "to try one of the most complex and disturbing cases in our city's recent history." Ari felt Rivka squeeze his hand as the prosecutor rose to make his opening statement. The next few hours would be crucial. As the trial progressed, an intricate web of lies, corruption, and betrayal began to unravel before the stunned court. Financial documents revealed decades of fraud and money laundering. Witnesses, some trembling with fear, others with tears in their eyes, detailed years of intimidation and coercion. But it was when Ari took to the witness stand that the true magnitude of the scandal came to light. "Mr. Goldstein," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court how your investigation began." Ari took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room before, settling on his grandfather's diary, now a crucial piece of evidence. "It all started with a whisper," he said, his voice gaining strength. "A family secret that shouldn't have been revealed." He recounted his journey, from the initial discovery to the threats, the clandestine investigations, and finally, the decision to expose everything. With each revelation, audible gasps echoed around the room. "The fire at the Beit Yaakov synagogue," Ari continued, his voice now charged with emotion, "was not an accident, nor an isolated act of fraud. It was the turning point in a conspiracy that had lasted for generations." He then revealed the shocking connection the fire had been orchestrated to cover up evidence of a much larger scheme. Incriminating documents, records of illegal transactions, everything had been stored in the synagogue, considered a safe place and above suspicion. "My own grandfather," Ari said, tears in his eyes, "was part of it, not out of malice, but out of fear and coercion. And this pattern repeated itself for decades, with each new generation being drawn into the scheme, whether out of greed, fear, or a distorted sense of loyalty to the community." Ari's testimony lasted for hours, interrupted only by brief recesses. When he finally got down from the witness stand, he felt exhausted, but strangely light. During one of these recesses, Ari was approached by one of the accused, a man he had known since childhood. "You don't understand what you've done," the man hissed, his face contorted with anger and fear. "You've destroyed everything." Before Ari could respond, security guards intervened, pushing the man away. But his words echoed, reminding Ari of the high price everyone was paying for the truth. Rivka found Ari in the corridor, hugging him tightly. "Are you all right?" she asked, concern evident in her eyes. Ari nodded slowly. "I'm fine, but this is just the beginning, isn't it?" Rabbi Levi approached, his face a mixture of pride and regret. "You did the right thing, Ari. But the road ahead will be difficult. Our community will never be the same." As the trial drew to a close, the tension in the room was palpable. The jury retired to deliberate, leaving everyone in a state of agonizing suspense. Ari observed the faces around him, families divided, friends now on opposite sides of the law, an entire community on the verge of a profound and painful transformation. After what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned. The silence in the room was deafening as the judge called for the verdict. Guilty, the word echoed, followed by a list of names and charges. The reaction was immediate and intense. Cries of anguish were mixed with sighs of relief. Some of the condemned collapsed into their chairs, while others maintained a stoic facade. Ari felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, a bittersweet sense of justice finally being done. He saw tears in the eyes of Shmuel and other survivors of the fire. Decades of pain finally finding some form of resolution. As the judge began to hand down the sentences, Ari realized that this was not the end, but only the beginning of a long process of healing and rebuilding. As he left the courtroom, Ari was greeted by a crowd. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashed, but it was the faces of his neighbors, friends, and community members that captured his attention. There was anger on some faces, accusation on others, but there was also gratitude, relief, and surprisingly, hope. A young rabbi approached Ari, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving us the chance to start again, to build something better." As he walked through the streets of Jerusalem that evening, Ari reflected on the journey that had brought him here. What had begun as a personal search for the truth had turned into something much bigger. At home, reunited with Rivka and the children, Ari finally allowed the emotions of the day to overwhelm him. He cried for his grandfather, for the community he had come to know, for the years of lies, and for the challenges that were yet to come. "What happens now?" asked his eldest son, his eyes big with worry. Ari looked at his family, then at the window, where the lights of Jerusalem shone against the night sky. "Now," he said softly, "we rebuild, with honesty, with integrity. We've created a community we can truly be proud of." That night, while the city slept, the seeds of a new era began to germinate. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and obstacles. But for the first time in generations, it was a path illuminated by truth. Ari knew there was a lot of work ahead. Broken trust to rebuild, old wounds to heal, an entire community to reunite and reform. But looking at Rivka, at his children, at the city he loved, he felt something he hadn't felt for a long time: hope. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the promise of a new dawn for Jerusalem and its community. The sun rose over Jerusalem, its golden rays illuminating a city in transformation. A year had passed since the trial that had shaken the foundations of the local Jewish community. Ari Goldstein watched the familiar landscape from his window, reflecting on the drastic changes that had taken place. The streets that were once the scene of whispers and suspicious glances now witnessed open conversations and cautious smiles. The shadow of secrecy that had hung over the community for decades had dissipated, leaving in its place a renewed sense of purpose. Ari took a deep breath, adjusting her kippah before leaving. Today was an important day, the reopening of the Beit Yaakov synagogue, rebuilt not only in structure but in spirit. As he walked along the cobbled streets, Ari noticed the looks he received. Some were of gratitude, others of silent respect, and some still bore traces of resentment. The truth had set many free, but it had also left deep scars. The square in front of the synagogue was packed. Familiar and new faces mingled in the crowd. Ari spotted Rivka and the children, who waved cheerfully. Next to him, Rabbi Levi, now one of the leaders of the reform movement in the community, smiled warmly. When Ari took the podium, a respectful silence fell over the assembly. "A year ago," he began, his voice firm, "we were divided by secrets and lies. Today, we come together, united by truth and hope." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. The rebuilding of this synagogue symbolizes our collective journey. Just as these walls were erected again, brick by brick, so we rebuild our community, relationship by relationship, truth by truth. Ari spoke about forgiveness, about the courage to face the past and the determination to shape a better future. He paid tribute to the victims of the original fire, whose names were now inscribed on a memorial plaque. "May this synagogue be a beacon of integrity," he concluded, "a constant reminder that our faith and our community are strongest when built on a foundation of honesty and compassion." As the ribbon was cut and the synagogue doors opened, Ari felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Shmuel, the survivor of the fire, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," Shmuel whispered, "for giving us back our dignity." In the months that followed, the community faced a number of challenges. The transition to a more transparent leadership was not easy. Heated debates erupted over how to deal with those who had been complicit in the corruption scheme. Ari, now part of a newly formed ethics board, often found himself at the center of these discussions. In one particularly tense meeting, he faced criticism from both sides. "You're being too soft on the guilty," shouted one man, his face red with anger. "And you're destroying families with your witch hunt," retorted another. Ari raised his hands, asking for calm. "I understand everyone's anger and frustration," he said, "but we must remember that the goal is not punishment, but restoration. We need to find a balance between justice and compassion." It was a slow and often painful process, but gradually, the community began to find its way. Restitution programs were set up to compensate the victims of the scam. Those who had been convicted and served their sentences were encouraged to take part in community projects as part of their reintegration. One evening, months after the reopening of the synagogue, Ari found himself alone in his home office. On the wall, framed, was the first page of his grandfather's diary, a constant reminder of where it all began. As he reread the familiar words, Ari reflected on his own journey. The search for the truth had cost him a lot: lost friendships, threats to his family, moments of deep doubt. But it had also brought a clarity and purpose he had never imagined possible. Rivka entered quietly, carrying a cup of tea. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly, noticing Ari's distant gaze. "About everything that's changed," he replied. "And everything that still needs to change." Rivka nodded understandingly. "You know, the children were talking today about the future. Danny said he wants to be a rabbi, but an honest one, like Daddy." Ari felt a lump in his throat. "They understand. More than we realize, don't they? They see the example you set," Rivka said, kissing him softly. "We all do." The next morning, Ari was surprised by an unexpected visitor. It was Moshe, his father's old friend who had warned him at the beginning of his journey. "Ari," Moshe said, looking old and tired, I've come to ask for forgiveness. I knew a lot of what was going on, but I kept silent out of fear." Ari looked at the older man, seeing the weight of guilt on his shoulders. "Moshe, the past can't be changed. But the future is still in our hands." Together, they walked to the synagogue, talking about the challenges the community still faced and the opportunities that lay ahead. When they arrived, they were greeted by an encouraging scene. A group of young people were organizing a job fair focused on ethical and transparent opportunities. In another corner, older members of the community were giving lessons in financial ethics. "See," Ari said, a smile forming on his lips. "We're healing, reinventing ourselves." Moshe nodded, tears in his eyes. "You've given us a second chance, Ari, a chance to be better." As the day progressed, Ari was approached by Sarah, a young local journalist. "Mr. Goldstein," she said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm, "I'm working on a series of reports about communities that have faced crises and emerged stronger. I'd like to tell your story, not just the scandal, but the process of healing and rebuilding." Ari hesitated for a moment. Sharing his story meant reopening old wounds, but it also offered the opportunity to inspire others. "You know, Sarah," he replied finally, "our story is still being written. Every day brings new challenges, new opportunities to do the right thing." He paused, looking around at the vibrant community that surrounded him. "But if our journey can help others find their way to truth and integrity, then it's worth sharing. As the sun set over Jerusalem, casting a golden glow over the ancient stones of the city, Ari felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead was still long, with many obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in generations, it was a path illuminated by truth, hope, and the promise of a better future. As he walked home, hand in hand with Rivka, Ari knew that this was not the end of his journey, but only the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter of rebuilding, of healing, and above all, of renewed faith, not just in God, but in humanity's ability to choose what is right, even in the face of the greatest adversity. The story of Ari Goldstein and his community would continue, serving as a beacon of hope and a testament to the transformative power of truth. And who knows what other stories of courage and redemption were yet to come, waiting to be told and lived.